Ableton Live has a whole bunch of really cool MIDI effect devices that allow you to manipulate MIDI notes in various ways to achieve some really cool results. However, one that shines above them all, in my opinion, is the humble Arpeggiator device. And in this video, I want to go through absolutely everything there is to know about the Arpeggiator MIDI effect device in Ableton Live so that you can know how to use it to its full potential. Now, this will be quite a dense video, so if there is something specific you're after, make sure to check the timestamps and the description so that you can jump ahead to learn exactly what it is you're after, and save this video for later so that you can come back to it and continue to learn and use it as a little bit of a reference point. Let's dive in. Okay, so first up, what actually is the Arpeggiator device and what does it do? Well, Ableton's Arpeggiator device is a MIDI effect that takes in a set of incoming MIDI notes and then plays them back in some kind of sequential or rhythmic order. The most classic example of this is sequencing the individual notes of a chord. So here I have a simple grand piano, and we can play a C major chord, for instance. Then if I open up this Arpeggiator device and turn it on, this is the default Arpeggiator. Take a listen to what happens. So with the default Arpeggiator device, when we feed this a chord, say a 3-note chord like a triad, it will then sequence the individual notes of this chord in an ascending fashion. And the rate of this sequence is going to be determined by the rate control. Currently this is set to 8th notes, but I could have it set to, say, 16th notes. Or I could have it set to a slower rate, like 1/4 note. Then the length of each of the individual notes is determined by the gate control here. So at a value of, say, 1%, each of the notes are going to be really short. In fact, 1% of the value of the rate, to be precise. And as I increase this gate control, we can go up to 200%, which is twice the length of the note determined by the rate control. So now that we understand the absolute basics of this device, let's take a look at what we can do with it in a lot more depth. First up, let's take a look at the style section, which allows us to adjust how these notes are sequenced and which order they're sequenced in. So we can find the style section here, which is the main section in the Arpeggiator device, and we can see this drop-down menu that currently says up next to style. We have 18 different styles that we can choose from here. And each of these sequence the incoming notes in a different way. We can choose a style from this drop-down menu, say I could choose down, or we could cycle through these different styles using the left and right arrows in the display below. And this display is actually quite useful because it also gives us a visual representation of exactly how this particular style is sequencing the incoming notes. So the up style sequences the notes in an ascending fashion from bottom to top and then repeats this sequence. Down does exactly the opposite, starting from the higher note and sequencing down to the lower note. Up, down combines these two, starts at the lowest note, goes up, plays the top note once, and then goes all the way down, plays the bottom note once, and then goes back up again. And then down, up does exactly the opposite, starting at the top, going down, and then going back up. Next, we have up and then down and up. And these two basically work exactly the same as up, down, and down, up. However, they repeat the bottom and the top notes of the sequence. So here we have up and down. And then we have down and up. And you'll hear that the top and bottom notes of the sequence are repeated. Next up, we have converge and diverge. Let's take a look at what converge does first. So converge will sequence the notes in a converging pattern. What this means effectively is that it will play the lowest note, then the highest note, then the second lowest note, then the second highest note, then the third lowest note, then the third highest note. And then once it's gone through all of those different notes, it will repeat that pattern again. It's not super easy to hear this with a 3-note chord, so instead let's play a 4-note chord so that we can hear the effect of this. And then diverge does the opposite. It starts on the inside notes and then goes outward. And then, as you've probably guessed, converge and diverge together combines these two, starting from the outside notes working inwards and then the inside notes working outwards. Again, this little graphical display in the center is really good for helping understand exactly what these different styles are doing. Next, we have some slightly interesting ones. We have the pinky up down, thumb up, and thumb up down. And what these do are repeat either the highest note or the lowest note, whilst also sequencing the notes in either an ascending fashion or an ascending then descending fashion. For instance, let's take a look at pinky up, where we can see that it begins at the lowest note, plays the highest note, then plays the second lowest note, plays the highest note, plays the third lowest note, plays the highest note, etc. Then pinky up down does exactly the same thing, except also plays the notes in a descending fashion. And then thumb up and thumb up down does the exact same thing, except repeats the lowest note instead of the highest note. So here we have thumb up. And then thumb up down, again ascending then descending for the entirety of the notes. Now we start to get into some slightly different styles. This next style is play order, which will sequence the notes in the order that they are played into the arpeggiated device whilst the notes are being held down. So let's go into play order, and we can see here that if I feed this a 3-note chord, for instance, it will play these notes back just like it would up. However, if I feed this arpeggiator a 3-note chord with the first note being the lowest note, the second note being the highest note, and then the third note being the middle note, this will be the order that the notes are then sequenced in and played back with the arpeggiator device. And this works for any number of notes. So I could do a 4 or 5-note chord as well, and I could play them in a random order, say the bottom note, the middle note, the highest note, the second lowest, and then the second highest, and take a listen to how it sounds. So this is really useful for kind of customizing the sequence of the arpeggio that you play back with the arpeggiator device. Next up, we have chord trigger. And chord trigger doesn't actually sequence the individual notes of the chord. Instead, what it does is take those notes of the chord and play them back simultaneously at a rate determined by the rate control. And what's nice about this is all of the notes of the chord will always hit at exactly the same time, regardless of when you input those notes. Now, the last 3 styles are different random styles, and these basically, as you probably guessed, randomize the sequence of the individual notes fed into the arpeggiator device. First up, we just have random, which will basically choose a note at random and play that note back. Next up, we have random other, and what this will do is basically make it so that no 2 notes will ever repeat in a row. But other than that, every single note is still randomized, it's just that we don't ever have a repeating note. Really good for consistently moving and evolving patterns. And next up, we have random once. And random once will basically choose a random order to sequence the incoming notes in, but then will retain that order across each of the different repetitions of that sequence. And then when I trigger another chord, it will randomize those notes again and play them back in that random sequence. It's kind of a nice mix of like randomization and predictability. So the style section also has a lot more to offer than just choosing between these different sequenced styles. For instance, we have the ability here to hold a particular sequence. Now, by default, a sequenced pattern will only play whilst particular notes are being held down. And if I let go of the notes, then the pattern will stop being played. However, with the hold control turned on, the notes will continue to be sequenced or arpeggiated even after we release them until we play an entirely new note. So as you saw there, I didn't actually have to hold down the notes for the pattern to continue to be playing, and it played a new pattern when I played some entirely new notes. Hold also has some interesting functionality in that we can add or remove notes from a sequence so long as we're holding down at least one of the notes from that original sequence. So if I want to add a new note to a sequence, so long as I'm holding down one of the original notes, all I need to do is press another note and that will add it to the sequence. If I want to remove a note from the sequence, I just need to press it again whilst I'm still holding down at least one of the original notes. So let's turn on hold, and what I'm going to do is hold down C, and I'm going to add a G into the sequence just by pressing it, and then I'm going to remove G from the sequence by pressing it again. And there you go. Now, as you can see, this section also has two other controls. We have the offset control and the groove control. The offset control allows us to shift the sequence so that it starts on a different note. For instance, if I'm playing a 3-note sequence, I can change the offset to 1 so that the sequence will begin on the second note, in this case the middle note, instead of the first note, which is the bottom note. And it's worth noting that offset can go in either a positive direction all the way up to 8 or a negative direction all the way down to -8. So you can have a really large sequence of notes and then play around with offsetting it to start at different positions in that sequence. Lastly, the groove section allows us to apply swing at either an 8th note swing, 16th note swing, or 32nd note swing to the notes of the sequence and how they're played back rhythmically. And what's interesting to note here is that the groove amount is actually determined by the global groove amount set in the groove pool. So by default, if I switch this to say swing 8ths and set my rate to 8th notes, I would expect this to be swung at 8th notes. But the reason it's not is because my default global groove amount is actually set to 0%. In order to change this, I need to show the groove pool by going up to the top left, clicking this little arrow and showing the groove pool, and then simply changing the global groove amount here to a value higher than 0%. And as I increase this, you'll hear that we start to apply some 8th note swing to our arpeggiated pattern. And this of course works for both the 16th note and the 32nd note swing grooves as well. Next up, let's take a look at the section right below the styles section, which is probably the heart and soul of the arpeggiator device. Now, the most important controls in this section are two that we've already looked at, which are the rate control and the gate control. Let's set the groove back to straight, and the rate control allows us to, of course, set the rate or the speed at which the notes are played back or sequenced once they're arpeggiated. Currently, we have this set to 8th notes, and I can set this to any kind of beat division all the way from 1 bar down to 1/128th note, or I can also have this set to milliseconds instead, going all the way from 10 milliseconds up to 1 whole second. Which can be really, really fun. Let's set this back to synced and change our rate to 1/4 note. And the gate control, as we've already seen, controls the length of the notes in the sequence. At 100%, the length of each of the notes are exactly the length determined by the rate control. So for example, here, when I have this gate set to 100% and my rate set to 1/4 note, each of the notes that are sequenced have a length of an entire quarter note. If I set this to its default value of 50%, now each of the notes are going to have a length of 1/8 note because it's half of a quarter note. And we can set this gate value anywhere from 1% all the way up to 200%, which is of course double the length determined by the rate control. Now in this section, there are two other controls, and these are probably my favorite two controls on the arpeggiator device, which are the distance and the steps controls, which work in tandem with one another to create some really cool outcomes. What these controls allow us to do is take in an incoming sequence, play it back, and then transpose the sequence either positive or negatively, and then play back the transposed version of of that sequence a certain number of times determined by the steps control. And this allows for some really complex and awesome patterns. Let me show you how it works. So let's set the gate back to 50%, and the steps parameter determines how many times the sequence is transposed. For instance, if I set this steps parameter to 1, we're now going to play back the original version of the sequence and then a version of the sequence that is transposed 1 time up a distance determined by the distance control. So in this particular example, we're going to get the original sequence played back and then a version of the sequence played back at 12 semitones higher than its original pitch. However, at a steps setting of 2, we have the original sequence played and then the transposed sequence played, but then we transpose the transposed sequence and then play that back after the originally transposed sequence was played. So let's set our steps value to 2, and you'll hear that we have the original sequence played back, and then we have the sequence transposed up 12 semitones played back, and then we have again the sequence transposed another 12 semitones played back again. However, if we set the distance control to say 7 semitones instead of 12 semitones, we now have the original sequence then transposed by 7 semitones and then transposed by another 7 semitones. So we now get this kind of increasing ascending pattern that is just tied to the semitonal relationship rather than any kind of octave relationship. So in this instance, our final repetition is 14 semitones higher than our initial notes played into the arpeggiator device. So with these two parameters, we can transpose our initial pattern anywhere from no times all the way up to 8 different times, each time having a distance anywhere from negative 24 semitones all the way up to an increase of 24 semitones from the original pattern sent into the arpeggiator device. However, this gets much cooler when we begin to integrate the scale mode in Ableton Live 12, which allows us to transpose not by semitones, but by scale degrees with this distance control. And what this does is effectively lock the output of the arpeggiator device to specific notes in the scale that we have set using the scale awareness feature of Ableton Live 12. So we can set our scale in 2 different ways. The first way is by going to the bottom right-hand corner of the device and selecting the scale type, and then choosing the root note here from the root note dropdown. Or we could of course use the scale awareness feature in Ableton Live 12 simply by engaging the little scale mode button at the top right hand of the device, which will now overwrite the root and scale controls of the device with the scale set by either the clip on the track or the kind of default scale set up the top of Ableton Live. For instance, because I don't have a MIDI clip currently on this track, I could set the kind of default scale to D minor, and we can see now that reflected in the arpeggiator device with its scale now set to D minor because it is currently set to scale mode. Now, if you don't know how scale awareness works, that's totally fine. I did a whole video about it, which you can check out with the card above or in the link in the description. For now, let's set the scale with the scale awareness feature of Ableton Live 12, leave it set to D minor, and take a look at how this affects the distance and steps control of the arpeggiator device. So as an example, let's set our distance to +1 scale degree and have our steps set all the way up to 8. And now if I play a note, say starting on a D, we're just going to be ascending the notes of the D minor scale. Or I could be a little bit more complicated and feed this arpeggiator device, say a D minor triad, and then we're going to get a whole bunch of different notes. Effectively playing ascending triads all locked to the D minor scale. And by using scale mode in this instance, I could just play around with the distance control, set our steps to a random value, and just play some interesting notes. And then I'm certain that all of the notes output from this arpeggiator device are going to be locked to the scale. And because of that, they're all going to be relatively consonant with one another, and we can get a really cool pattern. Using these two controls in conjunction with the scale mode, or even not with the scale mode, opens up a huge amount of possibilities. Just try it for yourself and see what you can come up with. So you probably thought that the steps section by itself was pretty cool, right? Well, let's take a look at the final two sections of the Arpeggiator device and see just how cool this device can really get. Before we do that though, if you'd like to learn more from me outside of these free YouTube videos, I actually have a monthly membership where you can get access to things like monthly exclusive videos, exclusive samples, monthly live masterclasses, and even one-on-one sessions. You'll find more info for that in the description or by going to matttinklermusic.com/monthly-membership. Or if you're not up for spending any money on membership, you can sign up to my newsletter where you'll get regular news, tips, tricks, and updates from me, and join the Discord where you can interact with me and other members of the community and even partake in monthly creative challenges. You'll find links for both of those in the description as well. So the final two sections of the Arpeggiator device are the Retrigger and Velocity sections. Now, if for whatever reason you don't see these sections, you can actually show or hide them by using the arrow in the top left of the device. Just by clicking on this will allow you to show or hide these two sections. That also includes the scale section down the bottom right of the device as well. The Retrigger section is kind of cool in that it allows us to actually re-trigger the initial sequence in a number of different ways. When the Retrigger mode is set to off, the sequence will only re-trigger when every single note has been released and new notes are then played. We have two other Retrigger modes. We have note and beat. When set to note, the sequence will re-trigger whenever a new note is played or fed into the Arpeggiator device, even whilst the original notes are currently being held down. And lastly, on the beat retrigger mode, this allows us to retrigger the sequence at certain rhythmic intervals, all the way from 1/16th note up to 4 bars. So for example, I could have the sequence retriggered every 1.5 bars, and that will allow me to lock the sequence to my session in a much more kind of nuanced and specific way. And we can see every single time the sequence is re-triggered, we have a little LED that flashes on just next to the re-trigger text. Now, this by itself is pretty cool, but it gets even cooler and more flexible when we take a look at the other parameter in this section, which is the repeats parameter. This parameter in and of itself sounds fairly simple. It allows us to choose the number of times the sequence will repeat before stopping. However, the number of repeats before stopping will reset every single time a new sequence is triggered with the retrigger mode. For instance, I could have the repeat set to 1. Now we're going to be playing through our sequence once, and then the sequence is going to be re-triggered every 1.5 bars. Just so we can hear this a little bit better, let's turn the steps down to 0 and take a listen. We have a single repeat, and then it's re-triggered at 1.5 bars. I could have the repeats set to 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 16 different repeats. And of course, we can come up with some really cool and interesting rhythmic patterns by setting the re-trigger interval to something a little bit more off-kilter, maybe like 5/4 or 9/8, and then setting the repeats to be maybe 2 or 3. And then when you of course combine this with the steps and the distance parameters and then start playing new notes and feeding the Arpeggiator device some different chords, maybe at irregular intervals, you can get some really cool results. Last but not least, we have the velocity section, which will allow us to adjust the velocity of each of the individual notes of the sequence over time. So if I engage the velocity section here, we can see we have 2 or 3 more parameters: the decay, the target, and the retrigger. So basically how this section works is that each of the notes will begin at their original velocity, and then over the course of the decay time will work their way towards the target velocity set here. For instance, let's turn off the retrigger setting, pull the repeats down to infinity, and set the target velocity down quite low to say 20 or 19. Now, over the course of a whole second, each of the individual notes of this sequence will work their way from their original velocity to a velocity of 19. I could increase the decay time. And we can hear the velocity of each of these notes getting softer over the course of that decay time, moving towards its target value of 19. Now, of course, this works in both directions, negative and positive. I could have the target value set all the way to 127, change the decay to something a bit more reasonable, like 2 seconds or something like that. And now we're going to increase the velocity of each of these notes over the course of this decay time. Or we could have the target velocity set somewhere in the middle, and then lower velocities will go higher and higher velocities will go lower, converging towards this target of 62 on our velocity setting. And lastly, the retrigger button in this velocity section here allows us to retrigger this kind of velocity decay based on the retrigger that we have set in the retrigger section in the device. And this allows us to create some really cool dynamic sequences. And so there you have it. That is basically everything you need to know about the Arpeggiator MIDI effect device in Ableton Live. It's a really cool device with a whole bunch of untapped functionality in my opinion, and I really recommend that you go and experiment with it, particularly with the distance and the steps and the retrigger settings to get some really interesting, unusual arpeggiated results and sequences. If you'd like to check out another deep dive on an Ableton Live device, you can check out this video right here. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, stay awesome, and I'll see you all in the next video.